how he could have been working for two men at once, two men who seemed to have almost in some ways mutually exclusive jobs. And it took a lot of research to figure out that in fact, it wasn't so uncommon, that there was all of this overlap that between these two services. And my grandfather's, stories from that time were, of course, absolutely chilling, because he had talked about not only participating in genocide and abductions, but also, as a member of the KGB during the Great Terror, of participating in, interrogations, which often ended in the person being killed on trumped up charges. So it made the experience of talking to him a deeply ambivalent one. How does it feel to have your grandfather be essentially a war criminal? I think that colored a lot of my interactions with Vasily when I first met him. And I'm sure that what he told me was a fraction of everything he had seen and done. And to get around to the part of your question about how he presented it, it was complicated because at first he wasn't very keen to talk about it. He understood that he had been in some ways on the wrong side of history. But at the same time, it was also a position of great power, right? Of proximity to great power. He had gone with Stalin to the summits at Yalta and to Tehran and in Potsdam, right. Which all happened in sequence. He recalls meeting befriending at one point one of the Secret Service men that were traveling with the FDR and becoming afraid when he realized that it might be seen as unpatriotic to consort with American Secret Service men. So he, in a sense, it was a very exciting job and a very privileged job. But of course, from the vantage point of today, I think he understood that a lot of it was amounted essentially to torture, genocide. So I think that there was kind of him trying to reconcile these different attitudes, what at the time must have felt like, essentially a position of great power, mixed with the current understanding of it as being in a position of great shame. And I think he was trying to weigh those emotions when he was talking to me. And I think it was only after his wife, Sonia, insisted that he come clean that he started to become more honest with me. Because at first he kind of avoided that period altogether, as though the 30s and 40s just didn't happen. And finally she kind of slammed her hand on the table and says, just tell him the truth. And that's when the story started coming.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. I want to dig into his work and stories from his time with Beria and Stalin, but there's one thing that jumps out to me when you mentioned that he served Stalin from the early 1940s up till his death. And what I thought was Stalin was known for his purges. It's typically high-level generals and politicians so that he wouldn't have competing factions and he could hold on to his power. But I think, how does somebody manage to survive purges? Did Stalin simply not do that to maybe lower-level functionaries and it was more higher up? Or did your grandfather somehow manage to strike an effective balance so that he wouldn't be targeted by the two men he served who were rivals? I mean, it sounds very dangerous, yet he made it through.
Well, it's weird that you say that because as far as I know, when I met my grandfather in 2004, he was Stalin's last living bodyguard. He was 93, and it was a job, obviously, that people didn't really live very long in. A lot of them were murdered. A lot of them officially murdered, meaning purged. Some were sent to the gulag. Some were shot. Quite a few committed suicide because I think the pressures of those jobs were unimaginable. The pressures on your sort of constitution, but also the pressures on your conscience. You were constantly doing things that were morally unthinkable. Most of the people purged by Stalin were innocent. And I think it was assumed that the charges leveled against them were not supposed to be real charges, that nobody believed them to be. At least most people, I think, understood that. People in the late 30s in Russia were killed by quota. Moscow called the local KGB office and said, we need this many people arrested today or this week. And that's how it was done. But to go back to your question, I think my grandfather was a person who could seem a little naive at times, which was very much not the way he really was. He was a quiet person. He was very handsome. And I think he was very good at taking orders without questioning them. He was obedient, he was efficient, but he was also quite smart, as I learned. And I think often he tried to use that to his own advantage. I'll give you an example. When I came back from meeting him, I started to do a lot of research about this period. And I found a book of, essentially a book of every member of the Soviet secret police who had been in any way remarkable. So anyone who had received high orders or medals, anyone who had gone to the big Communist Party conventions, anyone who had been in a position of leadership. And sure enough, I did not find my grandfather's name anywhere on those lists. And so I asked him about it afterwards in a phone call. And he said, well, you didn't want to stick out. You didn't want any notoriety. You didn't want any achievement because essentially it would make you a target. So in the 1930s, the secret police apparatus of the Soviet Union was purged 3 times, meaning all the leadership was essentially shot, imprisoned, and removed. I think the secret police was purged more than any other sector of Soviet society simply because Stalin didn't trust them, and also they had done horrible things that killing these people would essentially erase, right, to a certain way of thinking. And so my grandfather, I think, resisted any kind of promotion, resisted any kind of notoriety during those years, which essentially I think allowed him to survive. And he did it consciously, not through the way things turn out, but deliberately. He said one had to keep his own counsel then, and you didn't want to stick out. And he didn't, he was somebody who could play dumb, essentially. And I think that's what he chose to do all through the late 30s, because that was a time when so many of his coworkers, so many of his teachers had disappeared. I mean, he said he would come to work and the person would be gone, and all mention of them would be gone, and they would be airbrushed from photos, and so their names would be removed from official records. People just vanished. And I think he realized that this was probably that remaining in a low-level position and not making a lot of noise was probably the best way to live through that period, which is kind of remarkable because it didn't start out that way. My grandfather had been secretary of the Komsomol, which is the Young Communist League. Every university and school has it, and it was almost being like class president. So he had been the secretary of the Secret Police Academy in Moscow, where he had attended university, and because of that position, he was invited to a dinner in the Kremlin in 1932, celebrating the 15th anniversary of the Communist Revolution, which is a dinner where he met Stalin for the first time, years before he actually would work for him in his capacity as a bodyguard. It's also that dinner was the night when Stalin's wife was either committed suicide or was killed, depending on which account you believe in. So he had started out with all of this kind of promise of, a remarkable career, which never materialized because essentially it became too dangerous to have a remarkable career in the Soviet secret police.
Something that I've seen in terms of getting into the detailed lives of politicians and other people is that bodyguards probably have the best insider information of anyone. With presidential biographies in the United States, there are always references from bodyguards because they see the president when their guard is down. Eventually, a bodyguard might seem like wallpaper and you would say unguarded comments. So did he have insight into Beria and Stalin and have personal recollections of what they were like?
Yeah, I asked him that question, of course, because it's a really good question, and it's something people would generally want to know about. He told me that with Stalin, he said that he said Stalin spoke to him maybe 3 or 4 times. He told me that one of his jobs was Stalin would host banquets at the Kremlin, and usually people drink vodka because vodka was what you drank in the Soviet Union at that time. There was also some wine from Georgia. And one of the things, but people generally toasted with vodka. And one of the things that Stalin liked to do is he liked watching people drink while drinking water himself. Vodka doesn't look much different than water. So Stalin liked to see people get drunk because he believed it made them more honest while staying sober himself. And my grandfather stood sort of against the wall at these banquets. And there was inevitably a moment, he said, when somebody would raise a toast to Stalin's health. And because the tables were quite long, they would sometimes get up and try to approach Stalin physically to pronounce the toast. And his job was to essentially intercept this person who was probably already maybe a little bit in the bag and sort of guide them back to their seat. Because, you weren't allowed to approach Stalin physically. And my grandfather remarked that he thought that Stalin always pretended like he didn't notice this was happening, but he knew that Stalin really enjoyed the show of force. He really liked when this happened. He said that Stalin took real pleasure in, watching him do this. But generally, though, he said that he really admired Stalin as a person. He said that he was modest and comported himself modestly, and he was often concerned about people around him. He said that the first time he spoke to him, he said, "Are you getting your salary?" He wanted to know that people were okay. He really, I think my grandfather in a way really looked up to him. He thought he was, a great leader. Certainly at the time that he was his bodyguard, I think he told me that he thought that he was actually a really admirable person who was, modest and listened and, was not quick to anger. Of course, it's hard to square that with what we know about Stalin from history, right? So it's an interesting perspective. It's interesting to remember that during this time, a lot of people really looked at Stalin almost as a demigod, that this is not like a leader in a Western democracy. This was sort of the absolute leader who had, taken the country through incredible calamities, some of which, of course, were calamities of his own making, collectivization, the Great Terror, years of hunger and famine, of course, World War II. So I think people really did, a lot of Russians and a lot of Soviet citizens really did see Stalin as an almost godlike figure, so I'm not surprised that my grandfather, in a way, maybe shared in that a little bit. With Beria, I think he hated Beria. He told me that he did, because he said Beria was the smartest of them all. But and Beria really was, I think, a person of rare maliciousness. He was somebody who was, in some ways, incredibly cunning and very smart, but also somebody who, was the architect of the terror, was the architect of the Gulag, and kind of the person who carried out a lot of what we now know as the purges, and somebody who personally took great pleasure in causing people pain. There's a story from history books where Beria is brought up from Georgia. I think he was a deputy head of the Georgian Communist Party, and sometime in the late 30s, he's known Stalin from before. They're both Georgians, and he comes to Moscow, and he's now has this new job as the head of the secret police. So he invites his former boss from Georgia to Moscow. But this whole family, this is the former head of the Georgian Communist Party. This is in Simon Sebag Montefiore's book about Stalin. And he gives this man a tour of Lubyanka, which is the great KGB prison in the center of Moscow. And during this tour, he locks this guy and his wife in one cell and puts their teenage son in the cell opposite, so they can see, and has his guards beat their son to death while they watch. And then he throws a, poisonous snake into their cell and leaves. That's the kind of man he was. That's, he was really, I think you can honestly say that he was a sadist, somebody who truly enjoyed inflicting harm and pain on people. And I think, and my grandfather said, I hated him more than anyone. he was the worst of them, and also the smartest.